everybody. Thank you so much for joining this session. I'm Karen Mossinger, President and CEO of the National Museum of Industrial History. Thanks again for coming to Steel Weekend 2022. This year, we are highlighting shipbuilding and the workers at Sparrows Point. At one point, Bethlehem Shipbuilding, a subsidiary company of Bethlehem Steel Corporation, was the largest shipbuilding enterprise in the world. Eugene Grace famously promised to build a ship a day during World War II and delivered on that promise and actually surpassed it. Today we will learn more about the story behind this international maritime power. It's my honor to introduce Bob Bilheimer. Coming from a Bethlehem Steel family whose heritage at the company goes back over a century, Bob joined Bethlehem Steel as a member of the Loop Management Training Course in 1981. He spent his entire career at Bethlehem Steel in public affairs, primarily in government and community affairs and corporate communications. In the early 90s, he served as Director of Public Affairs at Bethlehem Burns Harbor Division in Burns Harbor, Indiana. In 1998, he returned to Bethlehem as General Manager of Public Affairs. As GM, he was responsible for corporate communications, including oversight of the Schwab Memorial Library, and where he served as the last editor of Bethlehem Steel's renowned corporate magazine, the Bethlehem Review. Bob is a graduate of Gettysburg College with a BA in Business Administration, holds an MBA from Lehigh University. For decades, Bob has studied the American steel industry and is an expert in Bethlehem Steel corporate history. Today, Bob is the General Manager of the Industrial Archives and Library in Bethlehem, PA. So please join me in welcoming Bob Bilheimer.
Thanks very much, Kara. It's really my honor to be here today to talk to you about Bethlehem Steel and this particular history, or this particular subject on shipbuilding. Just a quick show of hands. How many former Bethlehem Steel employees do we have in the audience here? And of course, Hank, Dave, put your hands up too. And I have to say, I'm incredibly honored here today, folks, that we've got Hank Barnett, former CEO and Chairman of Bethlehem Steel Corporation, Dave Cleanus, former Vice President of Bethlehem Steel Shipbuilding. So these guys could make the talk today. I'll just turn the microphone over to you guys and you can do it. How's that? But no, I'm incredibly honored to be here. And I can see that I'm talking to a fairly knowledgeable crowd about Bethlehem Steel. But I, like you, probably didn't know a whole lot much about Bethlehem Steel Shipbuilding, except for you, Jane, since you have the family history there. But there are stories about Bethlehem, I think, that we don't fully appreciate. Like, I'm from Bethlehem. I'm from the Lehigh Valley. So for me, my perception or my reality about Bethlehem Steel is what happened right over here on the banks of the Lehigh River. I didn't really have a good appreciation or awareness for what happened outside of the Lehigh Valley. I didn't know Bethlehem was a shipbuilder. I didn't know Bethlehem Steel had all the plants and operations that it did across the country and around the world. And I suspect that's probably the same thing for you too. So I picked out this subject to talk about today because I think it's a subject that's under-remembered, under-told, and not as well remembered as it should be. And it should be remembered. This is a great story about Bethlehem Steel Shipbuilding. And as Kara said, Bethlehem Steel was once the largest shipbuilder in the world. For most of its history, it was also the largest shipbuilder in the United States. And we're not just talking about tugboats and barges. We're talking about some of the most major vessels that the United States ever produced. So it's my honor here today to tell you a little bit about the Bethlehem Shipbuilding story, a story that you probably don't know, and really in a broader sense, to celebrate Bethlehem Steel and Bethlehem Steel's history. That's what this is what this weekend is all about. Bethlehem Steel was a great company, and it did great things. And it did great things for over a century. And I think it's time that we stop and pause and kind of remember some of those stories, because Bethlehem Steel is one of those companies whose influence went beyond just the industry in which it was, the steel industry. It is a transcendent company. It tended to have an influence beyond itself. One of only the handful of companies really in American history that you claim that would do that. Bethlehem Steel gave poor immigrant families a chance to be raised up in a path to the middle class. Bethlehem Steel shaped communities, and Bethlehem Steel helped defend and shape this world. And that's part of what the story we're going to talk about today with Bethlehem Steel Shipbuilding. So I'm really pleased that you're here today, and hopefully maybe I can enlighten you on a story that maybe you just don't know as much about as you should. So let's jump right in there. And I'm blind, so I have to put my glasses on. Shipbuilding. You know, sometimes when I say to people Bethlehem Steel was a shipbuilder, they say, what? Huh? What are you talking about? Like I have two heads, because they think, you know, you can't get ships up and down the Lehigh River. What are you talking about, Bilheimer? Well, obviously Bethlehem shipbuilding operations were outside of the Lehigh Valley and outside this area, but it was all around the country and all around the world. And yes, Bethlehem Steel was a major shipbuilder. Also part of a very colossally large organization. This is just a snapshot in 1945 of what Bethlehem was. And you can see it was the largest shipbuilder in the world, but it also was the second largest steelmaker in the world. And you can see it had 9 plants, 10 shipyards, it just goes on and on. 9 steel plants from coast to coast in 1945 across the United States. 10 shipyards on both coasts. A little bit after World War II, there would also be a shipyard on the Gulf Coast. But in 1945, both coasts, east and west. And this is a stat that I find fascinating. In some ways, really, you could say that Bethlehem, as large of a steelmaker as it was actually even a larger shipbuilder in terms of total employment. This is 1943, which is the peak year for Bethlehem Steel employment. The company had 300,000 employees. 180,000 were in shipbuilding. That means there was only 120,000 in steel. So in one important way, it was actually a bigger shipbuilder than it was a steelmaker, and it was the second largest steelmaker in the world. You have to also understand that shipbuilding is in Bethlehem's DNA. What I mean by that is that shipbuilding has been part of Bethlehem Steel since the very beginning of Bethlehem Steel Corporation in 1904. And really, when you look before 1904, and from what John Fritz and the Bethlehem Iron Company did with the armaments and the naval munitions and the armor plate, Bethlehem has had a relationship with the U.S. Navy. It has been in the maritime business really since its very beginning. And shipbuilding is in Bethlehem's DNA. It's because of this man, really, why Bethlehem is a shipbuilder, why Bethlehem Steel even exists at all. This is Charles Schwab. And we're not talking about the discount broker. You know, people these days say, oh yeah, Schwab, that's the guy that owns the Schwab discount brokerage firm. No, it's no relation. This is the financier, Charles Schwab. He was an incredibly interesting character. He was an industrial genius. He was pretty much self-taught. He went to school until he was 17 years old, but became one of the richest and most powerful men in American industry. And he was an interesting character, and you really have to understand Bethlehem Steel, you really have to understand Charles Schwab, because he's the one that put the company together. I mean, he was gregarious, he was a ladies' man, he was great with people, he was an extrovert, but he was also extremely shrewd. He could size up people, he could size up businesses, and he knew a deal when he saw it. And so he was the guy that was behind Bethlehem Steel from the very beginning. He was born in 1862. There's a picture of Schwab on the cover of Harper's Weekly a little bit later in his career, but he had a meteoric rise in his career, and I'm not going to go through all the details, but just suffice it to say that he started at age 17 as a clerk in a general store, but by 35 he was president of Carnegie Steel, which was the largest steel company in America at the time. Just an incredible rise that he had all through the ranks. In 1901, at age 39, he was also the first president of U.S. Steel. And he helped broker the deal between Andrew Carnegie, who was the head of Carnegie Steel, and J.P. Morgan, who wanted to buy him out to start U.S. Steel. And so Schwab was the go-between. And so when the deal happened for $400 million, making Carnegie the richest man essentially in the world, Charles Schwab was named the first president of U.S. Steel. But Schwab was a steel man, and he wanted to have his own hand in running the company, and he didn't really have a free hand in running U.S. Steel, and it always kind of rankled him a little bit that he wasn't able to do that. So he was looking elsewhere, and he seized upon Bethlehem Steel Company. Now this is not Bethlehem Steel Corporation, this is before the corporation was formed. He purchased Bethlehem Steel Company as a private investment, his own portfolio. The heads of U.S. Steel, J.P. Morgan and company, didn't think that was such a really prudent thing to do, being the president of U.S. Steel and having a private investment in another competitor. So he divested in Bethlehem for a time, and J.P. Morgan took Bethlehem off his hands. But, you know, you might want to ask the question, why Bethlehem? Why did Charles Schwab seize upon Bethlehem Steel Company to be the nucleus of this new company that he was going to eventually put together? Well, it's all about John Fritz, and if you haven't visited the exhibit across the hall here, please do, because that tells the story about how John Fritz, again, another industrial genius, a mechanical genius, self-taught engineer, brought the machinery, the technology, and the innovations that made Bethlehem Iron Company a real niche in the iron and steel industry in the early or the late 1800s. You have to understand also what was going on in the late 1800s at the time. The U.S. Navy was transitioning from an all-wood Navy and a Navy of sail to steel ships, which require armor plate, which require armaments, and Fritz had the foresight to convince the Bethlehem Iron Company management to invest in America's first heavy forging plant. And heavy forgings help you create munitions, the big guns, the armor plate. And so Bethlehem became the U.S. Navy's first and most important military contractor. And a lot of historians will credit the birthplace of the American industrial defense industry as here in Bethlehem, the birthplace of the military industrial complex. So Schwab, I think, noticed what I would say a niche almost manufacturer here in Bethlehem, and decided that it was probably a good thing to invest in. In 1902, he was also instrumental in founding the United States Shipbuilding Corporation. Again, just as an aside in his many varied portfolio of interests, and helped form United States Shipbuilding. He reacquired Bethlehem Steel Company in 1902 and offered Bethlehem Steel Company to United States Shipbuilding, and it was absorbed into United States Shipbuilding. And this is another kind of fascinating fact that really you can also say that maybe Bethlehem was kind of a shipbuilder even before it was a steelmaker in a sense, because it was actually absorbed into United States Shipbuilding Corporation and was a subsidiary of that company before Bethlehem Steel was founded. It was really a tail that wagged the dog kind of story, because you had this collection of shipyards, and then you had the very large Bethlehem Steel Company plant here in Bethlehem. And it was by far the most important asset that the new corporation had, but it was a subsidiary of United States Shipbuilding Corporation. Schwab resigns under duress from U.S. Steel. He had a falling out with J.P. Morgan. He resigns in 1903, and he kind of left in a huff. And he decided he was going to try and go out and build a bigger and better U.S. Steel. And of course, he had United States Shipbuilding in his portfolio at that point. And so it just happened to fit in his plans. When United States Shipbuilding failed, he structured the company so that he would be the kind of the man in control if the company did fail. It did in 1903. Schwab gained complete control of the company, and that's what he used then to merge with Bethlehem Steel Company into the modern Bethlehem Steel Corporation in 1904. So starting in 1904 with the corporation, you can see that really its roots were in shipbuilding. It was in the United States Shipbuilding Corporation. Part of his strategy was what we call vertical integration, by both looking upstream for raw materials and downstream for finished products. The idea is to buy up the inputs, the upstream inputs into your process, and things like limestone and coke and coal, which Schwab did, and also to look downstream. And I think when you look downstream, you're thinking about finished products. And steel, of course, ships need a lot of steel. Not only do they need the armaments and the armor plate, but a lot of steel. And so it made sense for Schwab to acquire Bethlehem Steel Company and merge it into his new company, because it figured, hey, we're already building the armaments, we're already building the armor plate, let's build the whole ship. And so Bethlehem Steel Corporation was formed. It had the single plant here in Bethlehem. It included 8 shipbuilding and repair yards, and this is really the start of Bethlehem Steel Shipbuilding. The first one that was on the list, Harlan Hollingsworth in Wilmington, Delaware, on the Christina River, founded in 1836. The shipyard itself was built in 1841. It was also a maker of specialized railroad cars, and it was a manufacturing site as well as a shipyard. It was one of the oldest shipyards in the United States. Built the first steel hull for the U.S. with the steamer Olympian. 1844, built the Bangor, the first iron-going, sea-going propeller vessel in the U.S. 1926, it became strictly a manufacturing plant. 1942, shipbuilding resumed to make landing craft for World War II. And in 1943, Bethlehem Steel eventually sold Harlan and Hollingsworth. It also includes Samuel Moore and Sons, Elizabeth, New Jersey. 1886, established a machine shop on Newark Bay. 1889, the Crescent Shipyard and Iron Works was added. It was leased to a noted naval designer called Lewis Nixon. Nixon actually developed the country's first successful submarine, the SS-1 USS Holland, at the Crescent Shipyard in Elizabeth. 1906, they ceased production. The Moore plant continued, though, as a manufacturing site for Bethlehem Steel. 1916, they briefly revived shipbuilding for the World War I effort. 1921, shipbuilding is again discontinued there. 1931, a portion of the plant is sold, but the plant continued on as a manufacturing site well into the 1980s, where Bethlehem Steel had a wire rope mill depot, a rebar manufacturing plant, and a scrap handling facility. By far the most important of Bethlehem's early shipyards was the Union Iron Works in San Francisco, California, on San Francisco Bay. The Union Iron Works was one of the oldest and most important shipyards in this country, in San Francisco. It started in 1849, actually, as a manufacturing site, a machine shop by the Donahue brothers. By 1889, they established their location in the Potrero district of San Francisco, on San Francisco Bay, at 20th and Illinois Street. And there's the picture of the Bethlehem Steel ship headquarters in San Francisco. It was a beautiful Beaux-Arts building. There's the inside of it, just absolutely gorgeous. A showplace of the industry, really. But at Union Iron Works, in 1889, as I said, they established their location at 20th in Illinois. They were the oldest and largest shipyard on the West Coast. They produced machinery in 1859 for the Saginaw, which was the first naval vessel built on the Pacific coast. 1885, they began production of actual steel ships. They participated in that rebuild the United States Navy in the late 1800s. They produced the USS Charleston, which is a protected cruiser. They produced, in 1890, the USS Olympia, one of the most storied ship in the United States Navy. It was Admiral Dewey's flagship at the Battle of Manila Bay at the Spanish-American War of 1898. They also built the USS Oregon, one of the United States' earliest battleships. Nicknamed McKinley's Bulldog, it made a famous dash around the South American coast to get into action during the 1898 war. Again, one of the most famous ships in United States naval history, built at the Union Iron Works in San Francisco, California. It also included, ultimately, shipyards at Hunters Point and over across the bay in Alameda. There's an artist's depiction of the Hunters Point shipyard. It actually included 2 graving docks, dry docks. There's a picture of the USS Pennsylvania in dry dock at Hunters Point as a battleship. And there's an aerial photograph of the Alameda shipyard that Bethlehem eventually operated and actually produced troop ships during World War II at that location. San Francisco Yard went on to become an important shipbuilding, repair, and conversion site through 2 world wars. And they specialized in cargo ships, tankers, barges, warships, destroyers, escorts, light cruisers, and submarines. That's what the San Francisco Yard eventually specialized in. They also made kind of an interesting ship in 1957, the SS Angelo Petrie. It was a wine carrier, kind of interesting. You think of crude oil carriers. Well, this is a wine carrier. I thought that was kind of a really interesting ship, but it showed the kind of expertise and workmanship that the Bethlehem Steel shipyards could produce. They could produce any ship, really, of any size and any capability. They also produced in 1967 tunnel sections for the BART system in San Francisco, the rapid transit system. And Bethlehem actually made several tunnel sections for several tunnels throughout the United States, including the Big Dig in Boston, Baltimore Harbor, and of course San Francisco. So again, showed some of the versatility of the Bethlehem Steel workforce, and particularly the San Francisco Yard in the late 60s to do the BART tunnels. 1982, San Francisco was sold to Todd Shipyards and went out of the Bethlehem family. It's now Pier 70, if you've ever been out there. It's a mixed-use museum, restaurant, office, and residential site. It's quite a location. Remember the film Vertigo? If you remember the Jimmy Stewart film, 1958, that's actually the Bethlehem Steel San Francisco shipyard in in the picture behind the guy there. It didn't identify it as Bethlehem Steel Shipyard, but that was in fact San Francisco. Just an interesting little tidbit. So Bethlehem Steel Corporation started with 8 shipbuilding and repair yards. I went through the 4 major ones. There are also some minor ones here that Bethlehem divested of right away. So when Bethlehem Steel started in 1904, the shipbuilding portfolio was basically those 4 repair yards that I just mentioned. All the pieces were in place for the modern corporation. Also include the Aragua iron mines in Cuba. At this point in Bethlehem Steel's history, of course, other things were going on the steel side. 1908, Bethlehem developed the wide flange beam, ushered in the age of the skyscraper, and that story is well known around here. But that was going on just as Bethlehem Steel was starting, and Charles Schwab bet the whole company, really, on this unproven wide flange beam technology that literally changed the world. Over on this shipbuilding side, Bethlehem was not idle during this period as well. 1913, Bethlehem Steel acquired the Four River Shipbuilding Corporation in Quincy, Massachusetts. It was founded in 1884 as the Four River Engine Company by Thomas A. Watson, and yes, that is the Thomas A. Watson that said, Alexander Graham Bell said, "Watson, come here, I need you." That's the guy. He also went on to found the shipyard in 1884. The Four River Shipbuilding Corporation, the Four River Shipbuilding Yard, is really one of the most storied shipyards in the United States history. Located on the Greater Boston Harbor on the Weymouth Fore River in Quincy, Massachusetts. They actually founded it, like I said, in 1884. The shipyard itself was established in 1899 and moved 2 miles downstream at a site that was larger, that could accommodate larger ships and larger construction projects. In 1898, Fore River received a contract to build 2 of this country's first destroyers, the USS Lawrence and the USS McDonough. And this really set a pattern for Quincy, especially, to become one of the United States Navy's most important shipbuilders and one of the most important locations to build America's largest warships and commercial ships and submarine. This is what they specialized in Quincy. 1902, they built a very interesting craft. It's a 7-masted schooner. It's the largest schooner ever built, the Thomas W. Lawson. Really a one-of-a-kind ship. Again, shows the versatility of the kind of workforce that they had there at Quincy as well. 1904, they acquired the rights to produce Curtiss turbines, and they became a major producer of marine turbines and propulsion equipment. All the Bethlehem Steel shipyards not only made ships, but they made all the components for ships. And Fore River became a really important site for naval propulsion. Fore River got in trouble in 1913 when they were building the Argentine battleship, the Rivadavia. They kind of were on the verge of going belly up. Schwab made a smart decision. He decided, well, Bethlehem has all the armaments in the ship. Bethlehem was building the armor plate and the armament for the Rivadavia. And I guess he figured, if we don't want to lose that investment that we already made in the ship, we'll just buy the shipyard. So Bethlehem acquired Quincy in 1913, and that's when Bethlehem really became America's largest shipbuilder. It probably was before that. I can't determine exactly, but certainly from 1913 on, Bethlehem Steel was this country's largest shipbuilder. And backed with Bethlehem Steel's resources, the Fore River Yard was greatly expanded. 1914, they built the USS Nevada, Battleship 36. They nicknamed it the ship that wouldn't die. It survived the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. It survived 2 atomic bomb blasts at the Bikini Atoll in the Pacific Ocean. They tried to destroy it by gunfire, dive bomber attacks, and torpedoes. It still wouldn't go down. And they finally torpedoed it in 1948, and it went to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. They just found it, actually, recently. But an amazing ship, and another amazing testament to the kind of workmanship that Bethlehem could produce in its shipyards. 1926, Bethlehem established the famous design department at Quincy, and the design department eventually became really world-renowned for naval design, and became kind of the go-to place. If you wanted to know about designing and building a ship, the Central Technical Department of Bethlehem Steel Corporation at Quincy was the place he went. And that's where Bethlehem developed a lot of its plans for its major ships. 1963, Bethlehem sold the shipyard to General Dynamics, and the Central Technical Division was relocated to Sparrows Point. Anybody recognize that guy? That's Joe Kennedy. That's the president's father. He was actually assistant general manager of the Four Rivers Shipbuilding plant in 1917. I guess when he decided he had had enough of banking, and maybe it was before he was getting into other business pursuits like bootlegging, but he decided he was going to try his hand at business, and he was the assistant manager of the Four Rivers Shipyard. Bethlehem Steel had an impact in many, many ways, in many profound ways, both large and small. But even the Kennedy family was a Bethlehem Steel family. It's there that he butt heads with Franklin Roosevelt, who was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Eventually, Joe Kennedy got appointed the head of the U.S. Maritime Commission, probably based partly on his relationship with Roosevelt and with his time at Fall River. Of course, they butted heads later when Roosevelt was president. 1916, Bethlehem took a big step forward. They acquired the Pennsylvania Steel Company, which was the Steelton plant of Bethlehem Steel, but it also included a subsidiary of Pennsylvania Steel Company called the Maryland Steel Company, which eventually became the Sparrows Point plant. They had a steel plant in Sparrows Point. When Bethlehem acquired Pennsylvania Steel Company and Maryland Steel Company, it acquired that plant and also a shipyard that Maryland Steel Company had developed at Sparrows Point. The shipyard itself was established in 1891. They developed and built the first ship to transit the Panama Canal, the SS Ancon. And the Sparrows Point shipyard came to specialize in very large cargo ships, ore carriers, passenger liners, very large and ultra-large supertankers, and conversions of all types. There's a copy, or there's a photo of the the SS Venor, which is a Bethlehem Steel ore carrier, which carried ore to and from South America to Sparrows Point primarily. And Bethlehem Steel built a whole fleet of ore carriers at Sparrows Point. 1953, the SS Andros C. This was one of 48 tankers that Bethlehem built at Sparrows Point, ranging from 27 to 29,000 deadweight tons from 1949 to 1957. And they were all built and powered by Bethlehem. 1964, as I mentioned, the world-renowned Central Technical Department relocated to Sparrows Point. 1971, Bethlehem added a 300,000 deadweight ton shipbuilding basin added at Sparrows Point. It was the largest and most modern in the country, and that allowed Bethlehem to build the very, very ultra-large supertankers. There's a picture of the USS, or the SS Overseas Alaska, I believe, which was one of those large supertankers. In 1981, they branched out and also started building drill rigs. Bethlehem was one of the pioneers of oil well drilling rigs in the United States, primarily in Beaumont, Texas, and I'll get to that in a minute. But as Bethlehem was contracting and divested itself from Beaumont, they also built drill rigs in Sparrows Point. In 1988, all of Bethlehem's marine construction was renamed the Baltimore Marine Division and relocated at Sparrows Point. And in 1997, the Sparrows Point Yard was sold to Veritas Capital, and now the whole place is actually called Trade Point Atlantic. There's no steel mill there anymore. There's no shipyard. It's a intermodal business park and transportation site. 1917, Bethlehem Steel Corporation, to consolidate all its shipbuilding organization, created the Bethlehem Shipbuilding Corporation Limited. Its headquarters was here in Bethlehem. If you look closely at the bottom of the picture, that was at the corner of Packer and Broadhead. That's what it looks like today. It's Lehigh University's Southside Commons student housing. But the Bethlehem Steel Shipbuilding Corporation started here in 1917 and was here until 1922 when it moved to New York City. World War I came along, and really, you heard some of the speakers out front here talk about World War I. World War I was a watershed moment in the history of Bethlehem Steel Corporation. No steel company in the country was better positioned for World War I than Bethlehem. And it was also true of Bethlehem Shipbuilding. overnight, really, Bethlehem became the most important location for military armaments during World War I, and really did become that arsenal democracy that you keep hearing about. There's a famous story. Charles Schwab went over to England at the invitation of Winston Churchill and Prime Minister David Lloyd George, and they were in desperate need of submarines. They asked Schwab if he could produce submarines for the war effort. In typical Schwab fashion, he said, "Yep, I can do that. I'll give you 20 submarines in 9 months." Well, he came back to the United States, and there was a little bit of a problem because there was this thing called neutrality. Bethlehem, or U.S., was not in the war yet, and so it wasn't really kosher for the United States to be building warships for England during the beginning parts of World War I. So he had to go back hat in hand back to England and tell Churchill and Kitchener and late David Lloyd George that, hey, I can't do the deal. And of course they were irate, but he said, I have a solution. And the typical Schwab fashion, he decided that he would build the submarines, but he'd build them in pieces in Bethlehem Steel yards around the country, send them up to the Vickers shipyard in Montreal, Canada, which of course Canada was a British possession in those days, or at least a member of the Commonwealth. And the British readily agreed to allowing Schwab and Bethlehem to use the Vickers shipyard in Montreal, and Schwab made good on his promise and produced the 20 submarines in 9 months. Just an interesting story, and it's an interesting story about how Charles Schwab was really a real wheeler and a dealer. As I mentioned, Bethlehem plant, here in Bethlehem especially, really was the most important and largest steelmaking facility in the country in 1918. We would not have won World War I without Bethlehem Steel. The output from Bethlehem Steel, Bethlehem plant, was truly staggering. And they called it the Krupp of America. And it was also true of shipbuilding as well. And in recognition of Schwab's position and Bethlehem's position in the U.S. naval market, essentially shipbuilding market, Schwab was appointed Director General of the Emergency Ship Fleet Corporation, and he helped direct America's World War I war effort, naval shipbuilding effort. That brought Eugene Grace onto the scene. Grace became president of Bethlehem Steel Corporation in 1916. Schwab was off running the U.S. Emergency Shipbuilding Corporation. Eugene Grace pretty much ran the everyday operation of Bethlehem Steel, something which he continued to do really until 1957 when he stepped away and retired. He passed away 3 years later. But Eugene Grace was another very interesting character, and really Bethlehem Steel today, or what it was, would not have been possible without Grace and Schwab. Bethlehem Steel also produced, was asked to develop 3 emergency facilities during World War I. The Squantum Victory Yard in Squantum, Quincy, Massachusetts, where they made destroyers. The Black Rock plant in Buffalo, and Fields Point plant in Providence, Rhode Island, where they made naval equipment. At Squantum, 1918, amazing story. Bethlehem established a world record for destroyer construction by building the USS Reed, complete from the laying of the keel to delivery in 45.5 days. Just amazing. Likewise, at the Alameda Yard, the Union Iron Works Alameda in Alameda, California in 1918, Bethlehem built the SS Invincible, launched in just 23 days and 23 hours from the laying of the keel. Again, just an extraordinary shipbuilding effort and a testament to what Bethlehem Steel was capable of doing at its shipyards. And this was just World War I. We haven't even gotten to World War II yet. Bethlehem Steel's war record, again, as I said, was staggering. We would not have had the war effort that we did without Bethlehem. You can see the stats there about all the armaments that Bethlehem produced, but also, even on the shipbuilding side, 22% of all the U.S. merchant ships, over 50% of the United States destroyer production in World War I. Truly an extraordinary effort, and it was a great war for Bethlehem Steel. David Lloyd George, after the war was over, he had been the former prime minister, said, "Charles Schwab was the first American to help us. He gave us the necessary equipment to continue the war to a successful ending for the Allies." And that was quite a testament to come from Britain. And that's the kind of friendship that Schwab had, especially with the English. And that would be true to form later when, of course, when Churchill was in charge during World War II. Bethlehem continued to expand its reach in shipbuilding and ship repair now in the post-World War I era. In Baltimore, expanded with the Key Highway Yard, and you can still see where the Key Highway Yard used to be in the inner harbor of Baltimore Harbor. A little bit further down, there was the Fort McHenry Yard, and between the two, they referred that as the Baltimore Works, and the ship repair and ship conversions in Baltimore Harbor. Also in Boston, the Atlantic Yard and the Simpson Dry Dock Company became the Simpson Yard in 1922. This is in East Boston. It's on the other side of the harbor from what you would think Boston Harbor or Boston proper, but it's very near Logan Airport, is where the Boston Shipbuilding or ship repair facility was, 1922. San Pedro, 1924, Los Angeles Harbor. Bethlehem acquired the San Pedro shipbuilding and ship repair facility. And in 1925, Bethlehem took another major step forward by building the United States' first true aircraft carrier, the USS Lexington. Lexington started as a cruiser, right? Thank you. And because of the Washington Naval Treaty, was converted into an aircraft carrier before they started actually building the superstructure of the ship. So it's considered the first. Oh, okay, sorry, I got something on my screen here. Let me just fix this. It was considered America's first aircraft carrier to be built from the keel up as a true aircraft carrier, and it was in 1925. They called it the Lady Lex. Beautiful ship, a very large aircraft carrier for its time in 1925, but unfortunately, the Lexington went down at the Battle of Coral Sea in May 8th, 1942, so we lost the Lexington. But Bethlehem is credited with building the first true aircraft carrier, and would go on to build many more in World War II. In the Great Depression, the Shipbuilding Corporation of Bethlehem helped in a very important way, because of course, with the economy being so depressed and the steel mills being so down because of lack of business, at least Bethlehem Steel had the shipbuilding division to help cushion the blow, help bring in some needed cash during the Great Depression. So Bethlehem was able to limp along really with only 2 years of losses in the Great Depression, 32 and 33. And in part it was because of the ameliorating effect of the Bethlehem Shipbuilding Corporation. Of course, Bethlehem at this time was also becoming a major fabricator and builder of major structures. And so during the 1930s, of course, the Golden Gate Bridge was built by Bethlehem, the George Washington Bridge, the Waldorf Astoria, the Merchandise Mart in Chicago, Rockefeller Plaza, and of course the famous picture of the guys on the beam out front. That's 30 Rock, the RCA building became the GE building. That's what they were building when they took that picture. US Supreme Court building. Very important structures. Bethlehem was moving forward in other ways, but the steel making, or the shipbuilding corporation was also moving forward. 1939 and 36, Bethlehem built 2 heavy cruisers, the Vincennes and the Quincy. Again, indicative of the kind of work that the Quincy yard could do. Unfortunately, both the Quincy and the Vincennes were lost at the Battle of Savo Island off of Guadalcanal in 1942. Considered maybe the most devastating defeat of the U.S. naval forces in World War II. They built passenger liners at Quincy as well. In 1931, the SS Mariposa, its sister ship, the Lurline. These were sort of the flagship of the Matson lines. They called them the White Fleet. The Lurline was sort of the queen of the Pacific run between San Francisco and Hawaii. And I'll just tell you on a personal note, my Aunt Betty went on the Lurline to went out to Hawaii to pick up my future uncle in Hawaii from the U.S. service in the U.S. Army. That uncle eventually became a member of the Bethlehem Steel Board of Directors. So it was just kind of a funny twist of fate, but my Aunt Betty went out on the Lurline to pick up my Uncle Bill. 1938, the Shipbuilding Corporation was redesignated the Bethlehem Steel Shipbuilding Division, kind of bring it more within the corporate fold. I had mentioned that the shipbuilding headquarters had moved to New York City to the Kennard Building at 25 Broadway in 1922, and that's where the Shipbuilding Corporation was headquartered until, what was it, Dave, 77, I think, when shipbuilding came back to Bethlehem, something like that. Anyway, it was Bethlehem Steel Shipbuilding was the only corporate department that was headquartered outside of Bethlehem during this time. 1938, the company decided to round out its ship repair capability. New York Harbor now became the site of the expansion. Bethlehem created or actually acquired 2 shipbuilding repair facilities in Brooklyn, New York, the 56th Street Shipyard on your left and the 27th Street Shipyard on your right. They acquired the Staten Island Shipyard, which also included a propeller shop, again in New York Harbor in 1938. And the Hoboken Yard, directly across the Hudson River from New York City. Here you can see the New York skyline and the Empire State Building in the background, and that was the shipbuilding facility in Hoboken. 1939, Charles Schwab dies. Grace takes over. Essentially, Grace had been running the company on a day-to-day basis, really almost since 1916, but now Grace is very much in charge. He's not chairman yet. They reserved that title for him later, but in honor of Schwab, Grace was the president of Bethlehem Steel, but not the chairman yet. Between the two, they ran the company really from its founding in 1904, well, December of 04, it was January of 05, really until until Grace died in 1960. World War II was the place where Bethlehem really took its place on the world stage, and this is true certainly in shipbuilding. Life magazine wrote at the time, Bethlehem is in effect the steel skeleton of Mr. Roosevelt's famous arsenal of democracy, and Grace runs the largest section of the US war effort. And so Bethlehem Steel, again, was perfectly positioned during World War II. They had passed the Two Ocean Navy Act in 1940 to help start ship construction, even before United States became involved in World War II. But Bethlehem Steel was perfectly positioned to take advantage of that, and Bethlehem Steel became the United States' most important, again, military contractor, and especially most important naval shipbuilder. Grace and Homer led the war effort. Grace, of course, is president, later chairman of Bethlehem Steel Corporation. Art Homer is the vice president of shipbuilding, and between the two of them, Bethlehem Steel conducted the largest, most comprehensive, and most diverse shipbuilding effort in all of human history. It was just an amazing effort. 1,121 ships. They're all depicted on that screen there. An artist drew each and every one of them. And if you look carefully, you can see 5 Essex-class carriers out there in the front, 1 battleship, the Massachusetts, many cruisers, many destroyers, destroyer escorts, victory ships, liberty ships, everything. And Bethlehem Steel was the most important shipbuilder really ever in world history. Grace famously promised a ship a day in 1943, and he made good on his promise when Bethlehem Steel produced 380 ships in 1943. Just an amazing, amazing effort. That's more than one a day. It also included, and this is another fascinating stat, 37,778 ships repaired during World War II at the Bethlehem yards. Just a staggering number. It included the battleship Massachusetts at Fort River. It was credited with firing the first and last 16-inch shots of World War II, one on Operation Torch and the other bombarding the coast of Japan in 1945. And there's Big Mamie, as they called her, produced by Bethlehem Fort River. Signature at Fort River were the 5 Essex-class carriers that Bethlehem Steel built during World War II. The Lexington, 1942, this is the second Lexington to replace the first one. The Bunker Hill, the Wasp, the second Wasp to replace the first one, which also Bethlehem built. The USS Hancock, and finally, USS Philippine Sea. 5 Essex-class aircraft carriers during World War II. They produced the USS Shipbuilding in an amazing 24 days. Again, just a testament to Bethlehem Steel workmanship. Also included the most important Liberty ship manufacturing facility in the United States, the Bethlehem Fairfield Yard in Baltimore. It was actually Bethlehem Steel's largest single manufacturing facility in terms of employment in all of Bethlehem Steel history, 45,000 employees. Even bigger than the steel mills. Just an amazing facility. They built the first Liberty ship, the SS Patrick Henry, and a total of 3 emergency shipyards that Bethlehem built and operated on behalf of the U.S. government during World War II. The Bethlehem Fairfield, which was a Liberty ship facility, Bethlehem Hingham, which made destroyer escorts, and Bethlehem Alameda, which made troop ships. That's where Bethlehem Hingham was, another amazing story. They selected the plot of ground, surveyed it, broke ground in February, and by June 1st, they laid the first keel, a complete shipyard in 1942 at Hingham. Just an extraordinary effort during the war. They produced the Reynolds, which eventually through Lend-Lease became a British warship in just 24 and a half days, another world record. And there's the record through 2 world wars. This is from 1905 through 1946, 2,920 ships, 800 naval vessels, 2,100 roughly merchant ships, just a staggering total. 1945, Homer becomes president of Bethlehem Steel, Eugene Grace becomes chairman. And in the post-war era, the two led the company again. They added Beaumont, Texas in 1947. It became an important and pioneering manufacturer of offshore oil rigs. And that was something that Bethlehem specialized in throughout the post-World War II era. Built the USS Salem, the first modern heavy cruiser. It's now a museum ship in Quincy, Massachusetts. The USS Independence and Constitution, I think the most beautiful, fastest, most luxurious passenger liners in the 1950s, both came out of Quincy, Massachusetts. Recognize that guy as Aristotle Onassis. Bethlehem's shipbuilding business was flagging a little bit in 1947. Aristotle Onassis came to the rescue, ordered 6 oil tankers, helped revive Bethlehem's shipbuilding business at just the right time at Sparrows Point, Maryland. Really important figure in Bethlehem Steel's shipbuilding history. Bethlehem also built war carriers on the Great Lakes. This is the SS Johnstown. In 1958, added the world's largest building basin in Quincy. That allowed Quincy to build the SS World Glory in 1954. It was the largest tanker ever built in the U.S. up to that point, 46,000 deadweight tons. Bethlehem would go on to build tankers of 100,000 deadweight and eventually 265,000 deadweight tons in Sparrows Point. Also the specialty chemical carrier, the SS Marine Dow Chem, which was the first ocean-going vessel ever constructed for the transport of liquid chemicals, came out of Quincy, Massachusetts during this period. The SS Manhattan, 1961, the largest commercial ship ever built in the history of the United States. It was eventually fitted with a icebreaker bow, you can see there, and made the first commercial transit of the Northwest Passage. During the time when they discovered oil in Alaska, they were trying to figure out how they could exploit the Alaskan oil find. They thought maybe they would be able to send ships like the Manhattan through the Northwest Passage to get it. Ultimately, it was not commercially feasible, but the Manhattan made the trip through the Northwest Passage, but ultimately they built the Alaska pipeline. 1960, Grace dies. Homer takes over as chairman. The Quincy Yard celebrates 70 years of shipbuilding, going from sail to nuclear power. And the first nuclear-powered warship, surface combatant in the United States Navy, the USS Long Beach, was built at Quincy in 1959. And there's a picture of the Long Beach in action. It was followed by the USS Bainbridge, the first nuclear-powered destroyer, a year later at Quincy. And in 1970, Bethlehem went international for the first time by developing the Bethlehem Singapore shipyard, mainly for the production of, again, offshore oil rigs in the international market. And it's a major step by Bethlehem. Bethlehem also developed a ship repair facility in Saudi Arabia during this time as well. Walt Williams had once been vice president of Bethlehem Steel Shipbuilding Corporation. He went on to become chairman and CEO of Bethlehem Steel Corporation 1986 to 1992, but he had a very significant stint of shipbuilding in his career portfolio. During this period, Bethlehem did a lot of ship conversions and repair. That's the QE2 at Hoboken and at Bayonne. She made 2 ports of call there to put on a penthouse and to do some further work. And she was a regular visitor at Hoboken. 77, Beth's ship, as we called it, moved back to Bethlehem. Bethlehem continued as a leader of offshore oil rig platforms, a major producer of very, very large tankers. That's the 1975, the SS Massachusetts, the first of the 265,000 deadweight ton tankers at Sparrows Point. Sparrows Point set a world record for tonnage in 1975 by delivering 530,000 tons, deadweight tons of naval construction, marine construction. 1988, all of Bethlehem's marine construction was consolidated at Sparrows Point. The fellow right back there in the green coat, Dave Klingus, was Bethlehem Steel's last vice president of shipbuilding, played an important leadership role during the post-war period of Bethlehem Steel's shipbuilding activities. But pretty much this era, I call it the long goodbye. As Bethlehem Steel's fortunes waned, of course, the shipbuilding's fortunes waned as well. And as Bethlehem started concentrating mainly on steel, started divesting and getting out of shipbuilding, and it was sort of the slow march, really. And you can see from 1951 when Bethlehem closed the Boston yard to 1997 when the Sparrows Point yard was closed, it was pretty much one closure and one sale of another. And that's pretty much Bethlehem Steel Shipbuilding, and now you know. So thank you very much for your attention, your time. There's a lot of information to kind of throw at you, but hopefully it gave you a feel for what Bethlehem Steel Shipbuilding was all about and the really vital role that Bethlehem Steel made in this country's history and really in world history as well. So I'll respond to some questions if people have any.